Linda Hawthorne was the perfect housewife. Sean Hawthorne was her charming 21-year-old stepson. 6 months after he moved in, both were found buried in a shallow grave, and her husband Richard was the only one left alive. This is the shocking story of how a forbidden affair spiraled into pregnancy, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder inside a home that appeared flawless from the outside. In a quiet suburb of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, nestled among neat rows of manicured lawns and picket fences, lived the Hawthorne family, a household that, from the outside, seemed to define the American dream. Neighbors often pointed to them as an example of balance, success, and good values. Richard Hawthorne was a well-known contractor who had built half the homes in their neighborhood and was respected for his charity work and steady temperament. His wife, Linda, was a soft-spoken housewife, admired for her elegance, kindness, and how gracefully she managed the home. Together, they gave off the air of harmony, two middle-aged partners aging peacefully under one roof. Richard had a son from a previous marriage, Sean, a tall, athletic, and charming 21-year-old who had spent most of his life away at boarding schools or with his biological mother. After some trouble adjusting to life at college, he had come to stay with the Hawthornes for the summer. At first, it was just meant to be a short visit, a break from dorm life. But summer stretched on and Sean stayed longer than planned. Linda welcomed him with open arms, insisting she was happy to have some youthful energy in the house. Richard, who worked long hours and often left town for construction projects, was relieved that someone was around to keep Linda company. Sean quickly settled into the rhythm of suburban life. He helped in the yard, ran errands, and spent afternoons lounging by the backyard pool. Linda often joined him. Neighbors would see them laughing together over drinks or talking on the porch late into the evening. No one suspected anything unusual. After all, Linda was his stepmother, and she had known Sean since he was a teenager. Their closeness was seen as motherly affection, a second chance for Linda to experience a kind of parenthood she never had. What no one knew was that Linda's marriage had begun to crumble long before Sean arrived. While Richard was a provider, he was distant, often emotionally unavailable, and increasingly absorbed in his business. The warmth that once defined their relationship had long since faded. Conversations were replaced with silence, intimacy had vanished, and Linda's days had become repetitive routines of chores, cooking, and loneliness. The arrival of Sean was, at first, a disruption but soon became a spark. As days turned into weeks, Sean's presence filled a void Linda didn't realize had grown so large. He complimented her meals, noticed when she changed her hairstyle, and asked her questions that made her feel seen again. She began to dress differently, first subtle changes, like wearing perfume again or choosing a brighter blouse, then more deliberate shifts. She smiled more often and seemed livelier. To outsiders, she was simply enjoying her role as a stepmother, but inside the house, a slow-burning tension had started. It began with long conversations that lingered too late. They would sit in the living room talking about music, travel, and things Linda felt she had forgotten she once loved. One evening, while watching an old movie, their hands brushed and neither pulled away. That moment opened a door they could never close again. What followed was a chain of impulsive decisions fueled by loneliness, desire, and denial. Linda tried to tell herself it was a mistake. Sean seemed uncertain too, but neither could stop. Each encounter was a secret sealed in silence, buried under the routine of daily life. Richard remained oblivious. He traveled frequently and rarely questioned what went on at home. He trusted Linda implicitly and had no reason to think his wife could ever betray him. When he did return home, the dynamic felt normal. Linda was attentive, Sean was respectful, and the house remained spotless. But behind that facade, guilt simmered, at least for Linda. Sean, young and impulsive, treated the affair like a forbidden thrill. For Linda, it was far more complicated. She was in her 40s, married to a man she no longer connected with, and emotionally entangled in something she never anticipated. As the summer wore on, their secret world grew deeper, darker, and more desperate. What had started as a single mistake became a pattern: hidden glances at the dinner table, quiet footsteps at night, careful lies told to avoid suspicion. Linda found herself torn between the role she played during the day and the life she lived in secret when the sun went down. The danger of being caught added to the excitement but also amplified the fear. Every knock at the door felt like it could shatter everything. Every time Richard came home early, her heart raced. The walls of the house felt tighter, the air heavier. And all the while a storm was building. One that none of them could see coming. A storm that would eventually tear the perfect picture apart, leaving only blood, betrayal, and silence in its wake. As the days of summer unfolded, the relationship between Linda and Sean moved far beyond subtle glances and hidden moments. Their secret became a daily routine, an addiction that neither of them could resist nor control. It no longer mattered that what they were doing was wrong morally. Legally, emotionally, it was a forbidden world they had built within the walls of a family home, and it was growing stronger each day. Sean spent most of his time at home, claiming to take online summer classes and help Linda with errands. Richard was away often, traveling to oversee new building sites and manage contractors in nearby towns. With the house practically to themselves, Linda and Sean became bolder. What had started as a few quiet afternoons behind closed doors turned into long mornings in bed, whispered meetings in the laundry room, and romantic gestures masked as household duties. Linda felt alive again. For the first time in years, she had someone who made her feel desirable, someone who listened to her stories, someone who made her laugh like she hadn't since her 20s. She didn't allow herself to think about the consequences. Every day she told herself it was temporary, just a phase, something that would fade when Sean returned to school. But deep down, she feared she didn't want it to end. Sean, on the other hand, was a mixture of arrogance and immaturity. He saw Linda as a conquest, a woman far older than him, someone he had seduced with charm and youth. He didn't understand the weight of what they were doing, not fully. To him, it was exciting, dangerous, a summer fantasy where he was the leading man. But beneath his confidence, there was growing anxiety. The affair was no longer a secret game. It was becoming something that could destroy lives. Still, he didn't stop. The neighbors noticed the shift, though no one could quite put their finger on it. Linda was different. She smiled more, wore brighter clothes, spent more time in her garden. Sean seemed unusually comfortable in the house. One neighbor even joked about how close the two had become. But rumors are just whispers until they find proof, and there was none. Not yet. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was early September when Linda missed her period. She was late by a few days, then a week. At first, she convinced herself it was stress or hormone changes. But as time passed, a nagging fear crept in. One quiet morning, while Sean was out, she took a pregnancy test in the upstairs bathroom. It turned positive almost instantly. Panic set in. She sat frozen on the bathroom floor, staring at the small plastic stick that had changed everything. Her hands trembled, her thoughts raced. How could she explain this? What would she say to Richard? To Sean, her world, once carefully hidden behind white curtains and clean dishes, had begun to unravel. Telling Sean was harder than she imagined. When she finally did, his reaction was far from supportive. He paced the room, muttered half-formed sentences, and avoided her eyes. He didn't want a child. He didn't want the burden. And he definitely didn't want to face his father with the truth. His retreat was quick. The intimacy they once shared dissolved into cold silence. Linda was left alone to deal with the reality she could no longer hide. Every day she looked at herself in the mirror, watching for signs of change. Her fear grew with her belly. She considered abortion but couldn't bring herself to do it. Her beliefs, her guilt, and her fear of being found out all collided, paralyzing her. Time was running out and she had no plan. Meanwhile, Richard had begun to sense something was off. The distance between him and his wife had grown, but now there was something else, something unspoken. Linda was distracted, secretive. Sean avoided conversations. The warmth of the household had vanished, replaced with a chilling silence that Richard couldn't ignore. He started asking questions. He came home unannounced. He checked the security cameras when no one was looking. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope at Richard's office. No return address, no handwriting. Just a printed note with 10 words that punched through his chest like a knife. Your wife is pregnant and it's not your baby. Richard didn't speak of it to anyone. Not right away, but from that moment on, he was no longer the clueless husband. He was a man betrayed, a man watching, a man planning. And while Linda tried to maintain her delicate lie, the walls around her had already started to collapse. The summer that once felt like a dream had now become a trap, and none of them would escape unscathed. Richard sat in his office long after the sun had gone down, the crumpled piece of paper resting on his desk like a ticking bomb. 10 words, typed and unsigned, had shattered the illusion of his stable life. He read them over and over, each time feeling the rage rise deeper in his chest. For the first time in years, he began to question everything: his wife's recent behavior, Sean's extended stay, the tension that had thickened in the house like smoke. He didn't confront Linda, not yet. Instead, he began watching more closely. He reviewed the home's security footage, noticing details he had never paid attention to before. How often Sean arrived home when he wasn't supposed to be there, how Linda lingered outside waiting for him, how the hallway lights flicked on late at night when Richard was away on business. He started making surprise returns from trips, hoping to catch something, anything, but Linda was always 2 steps ahead, polite, calm, and cheerful, as if nothing were wrong. Still, Richard knew, he didn't need proof to feel it in his gut. Something had shifted. The woman he had married, the one who once looked at him with admiration, now looked through him. Her eyes were distant, she smiled with effort. The warmth that once defined their home had been replaced with cold routines and careful words. Sean barely made eye contact anymore, always claiming to be tired or busy with schoolwork. He no longer joined Richard for dinner, and often disappeared into his room for hours. The silence between them all had become unbearable. Linda, meanwhile, was crumbling. She had grown pale and anxious, unable to hide the fatigue of carrying a secret she could no longer contain. The pregnancy was no longer invisible. Small changes in her body became harder to mask. She avoided tight clothing and stopped attending social events. She rarely left the house, claiming migraines or exhaustion. But the truth sat like a weight inside her, a constant reminder of a mistake that had spiraled beyond her control. She had tried to end things with Sean, but it was too late. The affair had left behind consequences that couldn't be undone. Sean had become withdrawn, avoiding her entirely. The boy who once looked at her with desire now barely spoke. Fear and shame gripped both of them, but neither had the courage to speak up or come clean. One rainy afternoon, Richard made a quiet call to a private investigator. He gave minimal information, asked for discreet surveillance, and waited. Days later, he received photos grainy but clear enough to confirm what he already knew. Linda and Sean holding hands behind the garden shed. A kiss exchanged on the back porch. A look between them that said everything without a single word. Richard didn't show anger, not yet. He continued life as usual, greeting Linda with a kiss on the cheek, having coffee at the breakfast table, asking Sean about his studies. But inside, his thoughts had grown darker. The betrayal had not only come from his wife, but from his own son. The humiliation was unbearable. His pride, his marriage, his family all shattered in silence, and then there was the unborn child. The idea that Linda was carrying Sean's child turned Richard's heart cold. He couldn't stop imagining it, a baby that wasn't his, growing under his roof, the product of deceit between the 2 people he trusted most. It wasn't just betrayal, it was war. On the surface, everything looked the same, but behind closed doors, tension reached its peak. Linda tried to maintain a sense of control, but Richard's quiet gaze unsettled her. He had become too calm, too polite. He asked questions he already knew the answers to. He listened more than he spoke. Sean, sensing danger, packed a bag one evening and told Linda he was thinking of returning to campus early. She begged him to wait. She wasn't ready to be left alone with Richard. That weekend, Richard announced a sudden business trip. He kissed Linda goodbye and drove off in his truck. But he never left the city. He checked into a small motel and watched the house from a distance. His car remained hidden. His phone was turned off. He waited. 2 nights later, the lights in the living room flickered on. Sean had come back. Through the basement window, Richard could see movement, 2 shadows arguing. He stayed still, hidden in the darkness, his heartbeat steady and cold. He waited hours. Then the house went quiet. The next morning, Richard returned home as if nothing had happened. The neighbors waved. He smiled. But inside, something was gone, emptied out like the echo of voices no longer present. Linda and Sean had vanished. Their rooms were undisturbed, but their phones were off. Their belongings remained untouched. The house was silent. He sat on the porch, sipping his coffee, and waited for the questions to begin. The first signs that something was wrong came quietly. A missed phone call, a forgotten appointment. Linda didn't show up for her weekly grocery trip, and Sean failed to respond to messages from his college advisor. At first, no one panicked. People assumed they were out of town or dealing with something personal. But as hours turned into days, the silence became unsettling. Inside the Hawthorne home, nothing appeared out of place. Linda's purse was on the kitchen counter, her reading glasses neatly folded beside a half-finished cup of tea. Sean's shoes were by the door, his backpack still leaned against the hallway wall. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no note left behind. The only person in the house was Richard, who calmly answered the door when a neighbor stopped by to check in. Richard's demeanor raised quiet questions. He didn't seem worried. He told people Linda had gone to visit a relative and Sean had returned to campus early. When asked why they didn't say goodbye, he simply shrugged and said it had been sudden. There was no emotion in his voice, just flat, practiced explanations that didn't match the growing unease. A few days later, someone called the police. An anonymous tip claimed there had been a loud argument and possibly a struggle at the Hawthorne house one evening. Officers arrived, asked questions, and conducted a basic walkthrough. Richard let them in without hesitation. The house was spotless, the beds were made, the garage was clean. Nothing looked suspicious, but something didn't feel right. The investigators took their time. They returned the next day with a warrant to search the home more thoroughly. This time, they looked in places that didn't normally matter in the attic, behind the furniture, and in the basement. That was where they made their first discovery. Inside the basement freezer, beneath bags of frozen vegetables and meat, they found a large tarp stained with what appeared to be blood. Tucked in a plastic storage bin nearby were rolls of duct tape, latex gloves, and a pair of scissors. A bottle of bleach sat on a nearby shelf, half empty. Forensics were called in, and tests confirmed that the blood belonged to both Linda and Sean. The case shifted immediately from a missing persons report to a suspected double homicide. Despite the evidence, Richard denied everything. He told detectives he had no idea how the tarp got there or why there would be blood in his basement. He insisted he had been out of town the night Linda and Sean supposedly disappeared. But his alibi crumbled quickly when hotel records failed to match his timeline. Surveillance footage from the street showed his truck parked a few blocks away from his own home on the same night he claimed to be traveling. What investigators couldn't find were the bodies. Without them, the case was stuck in limbo. Strong suspicions, blood evidence, circumstantial timelines, but no physical proof of death. Richard was not charged, not yet. Then came another chilling detail. In the kitchen trash bin, buried beneath food wrappers and paper towels, was a crumpled ultrasound photo. The name on the top corner read, Linda Hawthorne. The estimated gestation was 8 weeks. Investigators now knew that Linda had been pregnant at the time of her disappearance. Combined with the blood evidence, this discovery added urgency to the search. They began combing through Richard's properties, including his construction sites and the abandoned cabins he owned in the woods. For months, nothing turned up. The case stalled. The media picked up the story, dubbing it the stepchild affair. The local community, once full of admiration for the Hawthornes, now whispered about betrayal, secrets, and murder. People stopped waving to Richard. He kept to himself, staying inside his house with the windows shut and the curtains drawn. 6 months later, a breakthrough came by accident. After a season of heavy rainfall, a hiker trekking through the forest near one of Richard's old cabins stumbled upon disturbed earth. Curious, he dug a little and noticed a piece of cloth sticking out. He called the authorities immediately. When the site was excavated, 2 bodies were found buried in a shallow grave, 1 male, 1 female. The female was visibly pregnant. Both had injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. Dental records confirmed their identities, Linda and Sean. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. Richard was arrested that evening. He offered no resistance. He said nothing during the drive to the station, nothing during questioning, and nothing during the official reading of charges. He sat still, hands folded, eyes blank. The man who once held together a picture-perfect family now faced trial for a double murder that shattered every illusion he had built. But the most haunting part wasn't the violence or betrayal. It was the silence that followed. The trial of Richard Hawthorne became one of the most talked-about court cases in Idaho's recent history. The courtroom was packed: daily reporters, townspeople, former friends, and even strangers from nearby counties. Everyone wanted to see the man who had once been a symbol of success and family, values now facing the darkest accusations imaginable. Cameras were barred from the courtroom, but details leaked out quickly. The charges were clear: double homicide and concealment of a body, with the additional detail that one of the victims, Linda Hawthorne, had been pregnant with her stepson's child. The prosecution laid out the evidence in cold, methodical fashion. They showed the timeline of Linda's pregnancy, tied it to Sean's prolonged presence in the house, and presented photographs from a private investigator that revealed an inappropriate relationship between the two. Then came the blood evidence from the basement, the ultrasound photo found in the trash, and the GPS data that showed Richard's truck parked near the burial site on the night of the murders. Every piece of information painted a chilling picture of a man who had uncovered an unthinkable betrayal and responded with calculated violence. The defense had little to work with. Richard's legal team tried to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting that the blood could have been planted or that the relationship between Linda and Sean was misunderstood. They argued there was no footage or witness of the actual killings, no murder weapon directly linking Richard to the deaths. But the weight of evidence was crushing. His lack of emotion, his inability to offer a plausible explanation, and the digital breadcrumbs he left behind were too much to overcome. As the trial unfolded, more details emerged that the public hadn't known. Forensic analysis of the bodies revealed both Linda and Sean had suffered repeated blows to the head, consistent with a heavy object like a hammer. Linda's body showed signs of defensive wounds, indicating she had tried to fight back. The shallow grave, dug behind an unused cabin Richard had once built as a vacation home, had been hastily covered with pine branches and loose soil. Investigators speculated that he never expected the spring rains to erode the ground so quickly. Witness testimonies filled in the emotional context. A friend of Linda's said she had seemed nervous and withdrawn in her final weeks. A college advisor testified that Sean had been planning to leave suddenly but never followed through. A local grocer remembered seeing Richard buying bleach and duct tape days before the disappearance. Bit by bit, the image of a controlled, deliberate act replaced any thought of spontaneous rage. Richard never spoke during the trial, not to the press, not to the jury, not even in his own defense. He sat still, his face impassive, his hands folded in his lap. His silence only deepened the public's fascination and disgust. Some speculated that he believed silence was a form of strength. Others thought he simply had nothing to say. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, there was no reaction from Richard. He stood, nodded once, and allowed the bailiff to place the handcuffs around his wrists. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was quiet. There was no shouting, no celebration, just the heavy weight of justice being served. The aftermath left a lasting scar on the community. The Hawthorne house, once admired for its beauty, became a grim monument to tragedy. It remained empty for months, eventually falling into disrepair. Some people said they saw lights flicker at night or heard faint sounds coming from inside, though no one dared to enter. The neighborhood, once proud of the family that lived there, avoided the street altogether. In time, the story faded from headlines but never from memory. The case became a cautionary tale of secrets too dark to stay hidden, of lives destroyed by betrayal, and of how even the most perfect homes can conceal terrifying truths. The affair, the pregnancy, the murders, it was all too much for some to fully process. There was no grave marker for the unborn child. No one knew what name Linda would have given it, had it lived. That loss was buried quietly alongside everything else, another silent victim in a chain of choices that could never be undone. Richard Hawthorne now spends his days in a state penitentiary, far removed from the life he once built. He remains silent, declining interviews and never speaking about what happened. He has become a ghost in his own story, a man erased by his own rage. And so the story ends not with answers, but with absence. An empty house, a closed case, and a silence that lingers long after the voices are gone.